Good evening. Tonight we open with something faintly charged, slightly forbidden, and unmistakably human. The entire saga of MDMA. From seeming miracle medicine to what would later be branded a worldwide rave contagion. Set aside for a moment the neon folklore and festival legend. This origin story begins in chemistry workshops, quiet therapy offices, and waves of moral panic far more than on crowded dance floors. Drop into almost any scene in this narrative: clinical breakthroughs, underground gatherings, or courtroom clashes, and you'd quickly find yourself out of your depth. This is a story that demands you hold gratitude and unease in the same breath. Before you settle in too much, tap like and subscribe if this kind of long-form deep dive speaks to you. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is on your clock. It never stops being astonishing to see people watching from all over the planet. Silence your notifications. Take a slower breath. Let's begin. In 1912, in a cool gaslit lab on the outskirts of Darmstadt, an industrial chemist named Anton Köllisch let a faintly fragrant dark brown droplet fall into a glass vial and scribbled a notation that would lie dormant for decades in the margins of pharmaceutical history. He worked in the laboratories of Merck, a company already renowned across Europe for dyes, alkaloids, and the relentless push of chemical innovation. The offices smelled of paper dust and solvents. Ledger books lay spread under the glow of soft lamps. Men like Köllisch were paid to turn abstract chemical possibilities into things that could be patented, to bend the stubbornness of atoms into compounds that might be sold to physicians, armies, and the occasional eccentric inventor. In that particular year, the substance that would later be known as MDMA amounted to nothing more than another intermediate, a structural footnote tucked into a patent filing, just one step in a synthetic route toward compounds Merck hoped might pay off medically or commercially. There is something oddly, almost comically dignified about that original setting. A molecule born inside the orderly routines of a corporate lab, logged in the dry vocabulary of reagents, yields and purities, and then abandoned. At the time, amphetamine chemistry was a wide-open terrain, glittering with apparent promise. Researchers focused their attention on leading candidates that would become stimulants, nasal decongestants, or cardiovascular drugs. The methylenedioxy group, a small oxygen bridge arching across 2 points on an aromatic ring, was a structural curiosity that appeared here and there as chemists probed how to stabilize, extend, or tweak biological activity. Köllisch and his co-workers completed the forms, filed the claims, and the patent was awarded. The compound existed on paper and in dusty catalog listings. No one in Darmstadt imagined it would ever become a cultural emblem, or a centerpiece of ecstatic therapy, or a pressed tablet coveted on laser-lit dance floors years later. The decades that followed were not kind to idle molecules. Europe slid from imperial peace into the carnage of the First World War. And Merck, along with every other industrial powerhouse, redirected its technical skill toward immediate needs. Chemical agents, antiseptics, and the harsh arithmetic of survival. The molecule slept through it all, just a line item in a catalog, with no human champion to pull it off the shelf. Over the next 40 years, scientific conversations about psychoactive substances veered in other directions. Natural alkaloids, morphine derivatives, and later the synthetic families that became stimulants and tranquilizers dominated the pages of journals and the meetings of lab directors. The compound Köllisch had produced remained for decades a ghost in a patent record traceable by a specialist who knew exactly what to search for, but functionally invisible to everyone else. It is tempting, when telling a story like this, to dramatize that period of dormancy, to conjure a quiet conspiracy or a sudden wave of caution that banished the molecule to a drawer. The real explanation is much more mundane and colder. Priorities shift, grants dry up, and the molecules that don't immediately suggest profit or cure are simply archived. Those tiny entries in reagent catalogs are not trivial. They form the long tail of industrial chemistry, a reserve bench of possibilities that might someday find investigators with the right ambitions. So the compound lingered, Chemists traveling across Europe and eventually the Atlantic would sometimes glance at these listings. They saw potential raw material and not much else. For 40, 50 years, this little structure waited, faceless and patient. When it resurfaced in the second half of the 20th century, the social meanings attached to it had changed almost beyond recognition. What had once been just one intermediate in a Merck synthesis became, in the minds of a new generation, a point of entry into psychological states. That metamorphosis, from a dry line in a patent archive to a name appearing in therapist notes, police files, and club tracks, depended both on the strange chemistry of the molecule itself and on a culture ready to repurpose that chemistry. The long-shelved compound did not exactly wake up on its own. It was re-evaluated. Its possibilities were imagined anew by people operating in a completely different mode. Small independent labs, private psychotherapists, and a loose network of chemists who kept notebooks not only at their benches, but in the private corners of their lives. To understand why this re-evaluation happened, you have to move in close to the thing itself, its shape, its affinities, the path it takes through flesh and thought. Chemically, it sits within families whose names are now familiar even outside the lab: phenethylamines and amphetamines. These lineages form a branching tree in organic chemistry. A single tweak on the aromatic ring here, one extra methyl group on a nitrogen there, and the entire landscape of subjective experience can tilt. MDMA is a modestly ornamented member of this tree. The methylene-deoxy bridge spanning the benzene ring, the methyl group tucked by the nitrogen on paper, these look like small variations. In a living organism, they shift how the compound crosses membranes, how transport proteins recognize it, and how strongly it perturbs the fragile balance of neurotransmitters in the brain. Its pharmacology is at once blunt and surprisingly delicate. The central thing MDMA does is provoke a serotonin release. It persuades the serotonergic system to flood synapses in a way that standard stimulants do not. It gains entree into serotonin neurons largely by hijacking the serotonin transporter, the same protein normally tasked with vacuuming serotonin out of the synaptic cleft and returning it to the presynaptic terminal. Once inside, MDMA pushes the transporter to run in reverse and disrupts storage processes so that serotonin flows outward into the extracellular space instead of being conserved. The consequence is a powerful wave of serotonin signaling. The subjective correlate of that wave may be the drug's most distinctive signature: a broadened sense of ease in relating to others, a dampening of defensive fear. Clinicians and early psychonauts would later call this emotional access. Serotonin may be the headline act, but the story is not exclusively serotonergic. MDMA also nudges dopamine and norepinephrine systems, though typically to a lesser degree. Those secondary pushes add a stimulant's outline to the profile: faster pulse, modest physical energy, heightened alertness. Layered on top of that is a hormonal dimension. In many users, MDMA boosts the release of oxytocin, the peptide hormone that obstetricians and social neuroscientists invoke when they talk about mother-infant bonding, romantic closeness, or social warmth. Oxytocin's contribution to the MDMA experience is still argued about and anything but simple. Yet it likely plays some role in the distinctive blend of closeness, trust, and lowered social guardedness that people describe. Brain imaging work from later decades would show a pattern that matched these reports: reduced amygdala activity in response to social threat cues, altered connectivity in networks involved in understanding others' minds, and a temporary reshaping of how emotionally charged faces, voices, and situations are processed. In ordinary language, the world can feel kinder and other people less dangerous. Because these effects scale with how much and how quickly the drug is taken, dose and route of administration are not throwaway details. They sit at the center of each individual story. Swallowed as a pill or capsule, MDMA passes through the stomach, is partially transformed in the liver, and reaches the brain with a slow, steady rise, feelings building over half an hour or more, eventually leveling off for several hours. Taken intranasally, the onset is sharper, the climb steeper, and the peak abrupt. Intravenous use rare outside certain lab reports or fringe scenarios compresses the entire timeline even further, delivering intensity with almost no warning. Each pathway redraws the architecture of the experience. A long glowing evening at home is different from a sudden combustible rush in an overcrowded room. Within each of those patterns, dosage matters. A lower amount might simply smooth social jitters and make conversation flow more naturally. A higher dose can saturate color and sound, heighten tactile pleasure, and veer toward the overwhelming. The boundary between a therapeutic opening and an overamped, dysregulated state is not fixed. It's constantly negotiated among the body, the person's mindset, and the environment. Researchers, therapists, and attentive chroniclers eventually decided this particular cluster of effects needed its own name. Somewhere in the gap between classic psychedelics and straightforward stimulants, people coined a new term to capture the quality of emotional access, empathogen, from touching within. Others argued for empathogen, highlighting the drug's tendency to evoke empathy. These weren't just hair-splitting debates over vocabulary. The choice of label reflected an emerging recognition that MDMA did something neither LSD nor ordinary speed did. It did not primarily produce the sweeping visual distortions and ego-dissolving cosmic narratives typical of LSD, nor did it mainly drive the tense hyperactivity and blunt behavioral activation of amphetamines. Instead, it seemed to smooth the mind's social fabric, dropping defenses and allowing feelings that many users struggled to describe without reaching for spiritual or even theological language. Openness, deep intuition, a sense of luminous clarity about one's own emotional life. That clarity had concrete uses. In controlled therapeutic settings, clinicians who experimented with MDMA reported that patients could revisit traumatic memories without being locked down by overwhelming fear. The point was never that the substance magically erased problems. The idea was that it briefly lowered the mental walls enough for a person to look at painful material differently, more curious, less reflexively reactive, more able to speak. The neurochemistry sketched out a plausible mechanism. Serotonin flooding, amygdala quieting, and increased oxytocin working together to blunt the terror that renders some memories unapproachable, without necessarily stripping away the capacity to think and choose. The ethical and clinical questions this raised were enormous. Yet the basic pattern echoed across scattered case notes. People talked more freely. Therapists wrote of calmer, more penetrating sessions. At the same time, the molecule's kinetics and brain effects carried real hazards. The serotonin reservoir is not bottomless. After a peak, many people describe a come-down, marked by tiredness, low mood, and disturbed sleep. At the extreme end of physiology, MDMA can throw off the body's temperature regulation. In hot, cramped environments with intense physical exertion and poor fluid management, users face a genuine risk of hypothermia, core temperature soaring as the cooling systems fail. There's a related danger on the other side, hyponatremia or water intoxication. MDMA's influence on vasopressin and thirst, combined with anxious overdrinking of water, has in some tragic cases diluted blood sodium to dangerous levels, leading to brain swelling and seizures. Mix MDMA with other serotonin-boosting drugs, and you can trigger serotonin syndrome, a potentially fatal state of neuromuscular overactivity and unstable autonomic function. Animal studies added another troubling note. In some lab protocols, high or repeated doses of MDMA led to evidence of long-lasting damage to serotonin nerve endings. That work ignited debates that still haven't fully cooled. How directly do those animal findings map onto humans? Under what patterns of real-world use do risks rise sharply, and under which do they remain modest? The answers are not simple. They depend on frequency and intensity of use, on purity or adulteration, on context, and on biological individuality. Purity itself is a separate kind of danger. On the illicit market, a pill stamped ecstasy might indeed be MDMA. It might just as easily be an amphetamine blend, or PMA or PMMA chemicals that can be far more dangerous at similar doses. The social life of MDMA, once limited to obscure lab notebooks and low-key therapeutic offices, eventually collided with the murkier world of clandestine manufacturing and large-scale distribution. Cut powders, misbranded tablets, and the economic pressure to pump out massive quantities of product expanded a relatively narrow pharmacological entity into a street label that could cover a chaotic mix of drugs. Those market dynamics would fuel future disasters and policy fights. But in the quiet years of rediscovery, before ecstasy was shouted over nightclub speakers, chemists and therapists were mostly captivated by what the molecule did to the mind. It is at this point that Alexander Sasha Shulgin steps into view, a figure whose life embodied the uneasy marriage between rigorous bench chemistry and a near-devotional fascination with inner experience. Shulgin, an American chemist born in 1925 and based for much of his career in California, had precisely the temperament this revival required. He was at once an old-style synthetic chemist and a gifted explorer of consciousness, someone who treated his notebooks as if they were maps charting previously unseen countries. Through the 1960s and 1970s, as mainstream culture cycled through waves of psychedelic experimentation, Shulgin poured his attention into synthesizing variations of phenethylamines and amphetamines. He carefully catalogued not just yields and melting points, but also the subjective effects of each compound with a level of detail that bordered on tenderness. His return to MDMA was not a Hollywood eureka moment. It was more like the slow, exacting excavation that characterizes real chemistry. He came across an older reference, reconstructed the synthesis in his modest backyard lab, and then subjected the finished product to the least glamorous yet most revealing test, human self-assay, starting with himself. The myth that often attaches to stories like this, the lone chemist takes a dose and instantly glimpses a whole new world, contains a bit of truth but misses context. Shulgin operated systematically and, in his own subcultural way, ethically. Small initial doses, detailed written observations, repeated sessions over time, and a willingness to share what he found with a small trusted network of therapists and chemists who approached such work with an almost academic seriousness rather than a sensationalist impulse. What made Shulgin catalytic was not only his ability to synthesize, it was his habit of communication. He did not treat new molecules as trophies to be locked away. He wrote, he spoke, and in careful, understated fashion, he shared samples with experienced therapists who were curious about whether this compound could augment psychotherapy. One of the first clinicians to pick up that thread was a California therapist named Leo Zeff. After trying the substance himself in the late 1970s, Zeff recognized in it a powerful aid to therapeutic work and began integrating it into his practice. With the lyrical flair of a countercultural healer, he gave the drug a new name, Adam, a word meant to evoke a return to an unarmored original state. The term spread within certain circles, signaling a reframing of the molecule from anonymous industrial reagent to something intimate, almost liturgical in its use. Its early diffusion moved through networks that were hardly clandestine in the sinister sense. They were simply informal, made up of people who trusted one another with their reputations and their clients' well-being. Therapists in California, pockets of Colorado, and small enclaves in Europe began experimenting carefully, mixing what they called empathogenic sessions with more traditional therapeutic approaches. They compared notes. They described MDMA not as a magical substance, but as a door opener, a tool that demanded careful preparation and thoughtful integration afterward. The emerging culture around it was practical. Set and setting were emphasized, intake screening and aftercare were planned, and the possibility of harm was neither denied nor dramatized. This was an underground that looked more like a roaming graduate seminar than a crime ring. Quiet, ethically complicated, but earnest. Shulgin's impact was both chemical and cultural. He chronicled his experiments like a patient field biologist, listing subtle shifts in perception, bodily sensations, the restless insomnia that sometimes followed, the odd relationship to food, the melancholy that a few people felt the day after a session. Those pages became, by the late 20th century, foundational documents for a generation of psychonauts, and later for clinicians hoping to legitimize MDMA's therapeutic promise in the shadow of growing legal restrictions. The publication of his broad survey of phenethylamines and their effects, a blend of synthesis instructions, psychopharmacological speculation, and first-person reports, cemented a style of inquiry that fused laboratory rigor with the humility of participant observation. It was, in a sense, a lab notebook written in the direction of the bedside. The irony, viewed from a distance, is rich. A compound conceived, at least in the imaginations of early industrial chemists, as just another cog in the machinery of drug development, was coaxed into a second life by independent chemists and therapists who valued subjective nuance far more than market share. At first, the social scale was tiny, a scattering of therapists, a few chemists, a modest number of serious clients. The practicalities were intimate, small amber vials passed across kitchen tables, detailed instructions on how to structure a session, phone calls afterward to discuss reactions and integration. The unit of action was a single human being, not a market segment. That intimacy left a mark on the early culture of MDMA-assisted therapy. Because there were so few people involved, they could insist on personal accountability in a way that's almost impossible at scale. It would not stay that way. The compound's later migration into club life and mass illegal production would overwrite many of those norms. But for a stretch of time between Merck's patent lines and the future factories that would stamp out pills by the millions, MDMA lived chiefly as a tool for close, cautious experimentation and careful record-keeping. In those therapy rooms, people often described a particular contrast. Sensory detail felt keen, yet there was also a strong sense of inner clarity, as if someone had turned the lights up in a familiar room just enough to reveal the dust in the sunbeams and the fine creases in a friend's face. Sorrow could surface without crushing weight, and laughter often felt less like escape than like recognition. Therapists documented everything. Clients were encouraged to process and integrate afterward. There was no feeling that the compound's future was predetermined. It remained in many ways a fragile secret something that demanded stewardship if the slender line between helpful insight and psychic harm was to be honored. The psychonaut community that Shulgin helped cultivate was not just a cluster of thrill seekers. It was a knowledge network, a kind of distributed laboratory where information flowed along both formal and informal channels, journal articles, and mimeographed newsletters, conference talks and late-night conversations, bench notes and oral storytelling. That porousness was its greatest strength and also a core vulnerability. It allowed observations to spread quickly, what doses felt useful, what side effects alarmed people, which combinations were unwise. It also meant the practice could seep into contexts that weren't ready to handle the medical, psychological, and social risks. In the near term, this underground renaissance produced hopeful clinical anecdotes and a small, passionate community of users and therapists who believed deeply in MDMA's ability to dissolve certain entrenched defenses. Over the longer span, those same pathways of dissemination would transform the molecule into public property available to be used, misused, celebrated, or scapegoated. Shulgin's role was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was quieter and more durable, a chemist who bridged technical skill and a genuine fascination with human interiority, who published his findings without the theatrics of corporate marketing, and who carefully opened a door that others could cross. He trained a generation of amateur chemists and inspired therapists who, with varying degrees of caution, adopted MDMA as a therapeutic aid. He wrote in sufficient detail to allow others to repeat his observations, but he generally stopped short of giving step-by-step production instructions, a distinction that would matter a great deal once regulators and police started paying attention. Threaded beneath the chronicle of syntheses and subjective logs ran a human current of irony and tenderness. The compound story began in a German corporate lab, knitted into the capitalist machinery of pharmaceutical R&D. It was painstakingly documented and later quietly resurrected by an American tinkerer who loved to experiment, to annotate, and to talk about feelings as if they were rare species that might go extinct if no one described them. The people who first built MDMA's therapeutic reputation were, by temperament, caretakers. Therapists who saw altered states not as markets to exploit, but as clinical instruments. That fragile, localized ethic shaped the early years of MDMA's return. Eventually, it would collide with much larger forces: mass culture, underground factories, law enforcement, and political grandstanding that had little to do with gentle clinical inquiry. But that belongs to another phase of the story, a time when the molecule's social identity shifted again, and the ethical and regulatory puzzles multiplied. For the period we've been inhabiting, MDMA stayed in the custody of a small, curious tribe. Chemists with a craftsman's respect for the lab bench, clinicians who moved cautiously in softly lit offices, patients who discovered new textures of feeling. They moved through the world with a kind of slow attentiveness, convinced that the map of the mind could be revised by careful, small-scale interventions. The rest of the century would test that conviction in ways they could not yet imagine. For now, though, the path from a Merck patent annotation to a private therapy session had the calm symmetry of literature. A quiet passage from industrial anonymity to intimate use, guided by chemistry, curiosity, and a shared hunch that certain molecules handled with respect might enlarge our capacity to connect. When MDMA began slipping into therapy practices in the 1970s, it arrived like a small, well-mannered visitor. No hype, no advertising campaign, just a clear crystal in a vial that hinted at something older than professional jargon and newer than regulatory law. Therapists already trained in the delicate work of drawing truth out of reluctance suddenly had an unusual new instrument. It seemed to lower the armor around memory and emotion. Words came more easily. The mind's habitual defenses softened just enough that old pain could be touched, rather than reflexively deflected. People in conservative clothes in quiet rooms started calling the substance Adam, a private name chosen to pull the mouth back towards simpler language. Beginning innocence, a primal ability to speak without shame, immediately hardening around every sentence. The nickname was practical as well as poetic. It offered a layer of discretion that felt ethically protective to many early practitioners and reassuring to their clients. Alexander Shulgin's name often appears first in these accounts because he moved in that narrow band where chemistry overlapped with a careful, almost reverent interest in altered states. He had the lab mind, he charted the compound's effects, and when the moment seemed right, he quietly shared it with people he trusted. It was one thing for a synthetic to exist as a diagram and a melting point. It was another for a clinician to sit in a softly lit living room and watch someone inhale slowly, then begin to narrate their life without their usual defensive choreography. Leo Zeff, a California psychologist known for unconventional but deeply humane methods, became the most ardent of these early adopters. He taught small groups in the late 70s and early 80s in private workshops, an itinerant, pragmatic school of practice. He described how one guided session with the drug could open a temporary space in which long-standing marital patterns, early ghosts, and entrenched trauma could be seen and sometimes reshaped. He called it Adam. He urged colleagues to call it Adam as well, whispering the name like a small incantation against publicity and political backlash. The practice was artisanal. Rooms were deliberately softened away from anything that felt clinical. Couches layered with blankets, low lamps, a turntable or tape deck, loaded with music chosen for emotional tone rather than fashion. A co-therapist would often sit just beyond the client's direct line of sight. Not because the situation demanded an army of professionals, but because having another steady presence nearby felt like prudent protocol when working with heightened vulnerability. Dosing guidelines traveled along an almost oral tradition. Around 100 milligrams was frequently mentioned as a starting point enough to reliably ease anxiety without throwing a person into a disorienting, fully psychedelic detachment. There might be tea or water breaks every half hour or so. The possibility of a modest booster later if the intensity waned too soon, and long stretches of attentive listening. Sometimes the therapist said very little. Sometimes the client spoke for hours, and when speech finally dissolved into sobbing, the therapist stayed with it, making space for grief to be expressed in a way it had never quite been allowed to surface before. The range of problems treated read like a catalogue of human stuckness and pain. Couples who hadn't been able to speak honestly about sexual shame or past betrayals found with Adam the words to approach the hardened shells around their marriage. Survivors of assault discovered, within the warm gravity of the drug, just enough distance from their fear to tell their stories without re-traumatizing themselves. Veterans and others tangled in complex post-traumatic patterns sometimes navigated through the labyrinth of memory more successfully. Not always, not neatly, but often enough that therapists wrote "breakthrough" in their notes. These were case reports, not randomized, double-blind trials. The clinicians using Adam understood that. They recorded case histories in professional newsletters and small journals. They wrote long letters to each other, trading session outlines over coffee and at conferences. But the infrastructure for large, controlled studies simply wasn't there yet. The early accounts were vivid and, in a modest way, ecstatic. Physicians like Phil Wolfson and George Greer, who moved between mainstream psychiatric work and the fringes of sanctioned research, published some of the first small-scale clinical descriptions in the 1980s. They and others reported increased capacity to tolerate strong emotion, reduced fear responses, and an unusual ability for patients to recount painful episodes without collapsing. The write-ups read like the field logs of midwives attending the birth of long-suppressed feelings. Yet each glowing paragraph arrived with an unspoken footnote. These were uncontrolled observations steeped in clinician judgment. No placebos, no blinded raters, no robust tracking of long-term outcomes beyond what the therapist recorded. Passion outpaced proof. Human need is a powerful engine for conviction. It is a poor replacement for rigor. Ethical boundaries, already delicate in psychotherapy, grew thin in some corners. Before a drug becomes a headline and then a piece of legislation, there is often a hazy interval in which practices drift into legal gray zones that later look, at best, naive and at worst, negligent. Many therapists used MDMA in a brief window when it had not yet been listed as a controlled substance in the United States. That fragile grace period encouraged experimentation without clear oversight. Some practitioners did secure institutional review board approval for limited work. Much more unfolded off the books in that ambiguous space between innovation and regulation. Consent forms existed and were signed. Sometimes they were the only barrier between a therapist and potential prosecution. Others leaned instead on community norms. Do no harm, listen more than you speak. That informality had a darker edge. Suggestibility is a powerful, often underestimated force. A person under a compound that lowers fear and heightens trust may absorb hints and narratives more readily. They become more vulnerable to the therapist's interpretations, to storylines proposed in good faith but still shaped by someone in authority who is trying to make sense of fractured histories. Concerns about memory contamination became concrete rather than theoretical. Recollections surfaced during MDMA sessions sometimes found their way into legal testimony or family narratives. A therapist's authority can be profoundly healing. It can also be dangerous. As in any therapeutic community working with extreme vulnerability, reports of boundary violations emerged. Sexual misconduct, coercion, or the misuse of the therapeutic frame to pursue a personal or intimate agenda. The ethical discussions that followed were messy, painful, and essential. How do you protect someone at their most exposed when the method itself deliberately increases exposure? Meanwhile, the compound moved the way tools and ideas typically move when people cross between worlds. From Bay Area clinics and suburban consulting rooms, MDMA trickled into bars, apartments, and private gatherings. A client who felt lighter after a session might want to share that feeling with a partner at home. A trainee, more curious about social connection than clinical work, might bring a capsule to a dinner party. The first recreational uses were ordinary and human rather than glamorous. A folded piece of wax paper traded between friends. By the early 1980s, the drug had begun to collect new names outside the therapist milieu. Some people called it ecstasy, a word that advertised promise rather than origin. Others shortened it to XTC as if it were a password. Language carries weight. The move from Adam to ecstasy marked a cultural pivot. Adam whispered caution and therapeutic roots. Ecstasy shouted celebration, and the substance fit nightlife almost perfectly. Where LSD offered visionary landscapes and cannabis invited mythic inwardness, MDMA foregrounded people. It didn't demand that you stare into your own psyche or dissolve into cosmic metaphor. It let you look directly at the person beside you and mean what you said. In dim venues where strangers borrowed hours from the work week to practice the rigorous art of dancing, what many wanted most, then as now, was connection. MDMA-laced nights greased social friction and magnified shared joy. Nightlife is, at its core, a social technology. Once, alcohol was the primary solvent for the hedges between individuals. MDMA offered another path. Clarity instead of mental fog, tenderness instead of swagger. It was less about obliterating the self and more about finding someone to belong with for a few hours. Markets rose quickly to meet that desire. At first, distribution remained small-scale. Pills and powders passed hand to hand. Then came a more organized pill culture. Tablets stamped with simple icons, a skeletal branding strategy for something illegal and potentially dangerous. Logos did several jobs at once. They advertised, they reassured. They tried to give an unreliable grey market product some kind of recognizable identity. Buyers could point to a Mitsubishi symbol or a smiley face and say, with shaky confidence, "That's what my friend took." Producers in Europe, especially in the Netherlands and Germany, ramped up clandestine manufacturing throughout the 1980s and 90s. Relatively tolerant local policies, combined with strong chemical expertise in certain regions, created a production corridor that fed club scenes across the continent and beyond. By the time drug control agencies began tightening the screws, the recreational market was already sprawling. Pills, powders, and later crystalline MDMA moved by plane, ferry, and cargo, hidden among legitimate goods or funneled through small criminal networks. In some neighborhoods, sales became so open that police and communities developed an uneasy, negotiated coexistence. Stories about MDMA's social magic outran both science and law. Friends told each other about nights when a couple's hardened resentment dissolved into tears and forgiveness, or about parties where old conflicts melted, or about crowded rooms where loneliness temporarily receded. Those accounts were contagious. They leapt across universities, into New York clubs, London basements, Berlin bars. Street names multiplied as the drug shed its clinical skin and adopted a nightlife persona. Ecstasy. X. Later, in American slang, Molly, supposedly signaling pure crystalline MDMA. Those labels weren't just new sounds. They reflected shifts in how the substance was understood and who claimed it. If the 70s and early 80s were MDMA's quiet apprenticeship in therapy rooms, the late 80s marked its entry into mass culture as a cultural engine in its own right. Acid house, a mutation of Chicago's underground sound in the mid-1980s, found a natural ally in MDMA. The squelchy lines of the Roland TB-303 and hypnotic repetition appealed to the same hunger for rhythmic trance that MDMA intensified in dancers' bodies. It's no coincidence that some of the first big intersections between the drug and large-scale nightlife emerged in places where sound, light, and bodies were already pushing toward ecstatic states. Ibiza plays a mid-sized mythic role in this migration. British DJs and club kids who went to the Balearic Island in the mid to late 80s encountered a permissive late-night scene, eclectic sets, looser crowd norms. They came back to Britain with more than records. They imported an ethos of clubbing and, crucially, a drug habit. Danny Rampling, Paul Oakenfold, Nicky Holloway, and others are often cited as key carriers of the Ibiza influence back to London's underground in 1987 and 1988. Rampling opened Shoom in '87, a small hot club that became one of the centres of acid house and, incidentally, of ecstasy's social effects. In Manchester, the hacienda, already iconic thanks to Factory Records and New Order, evolved into another focal point for the new sound and the new drug. Then came Britain's so-called second summer of love across 1988 and 1989, when this particular collision of music and chemistry expanded into something the whole country noticed. Rave culture entered everyday speech. The look and feel were distinctive. Flyers for acid house nights often featured a bright yellow smiley face, which became a wry emblem. It was playful and defiant, a glowing smear of optimism against the dour political climate of late Thatcher-era Britain. The smiley was both joke and manifesto. We are here to dance, to be gentle, to drop suspicion. On the dance floor, MDMA encouraged new forms of contact, hands on strangers' shoulders, hugs traded as if between old friends. Conversations that would normally be impossible at a bar cut through noise and shyness. Each weekend, clubs staged a kind of temporary utopia. Small experimental communities spun from scent, sound, sweat, and a willingness to be more honest than the work week allowed. Across Europe, local variants emerged. In Berlin, especially after the wall fell in 1989, the scene took on a specific character. The city's abandoned spaces begged to be reimagined as zones of new social possibility. The Love Parade, begun in 1989 by Dr. Motta, grew from a few hundred devotees into a rolling celebration that drew hundreds of thousands. In Amsterdam and Rotterdam, a well-developed commercial club infrastructure and a comparatively tolerant drug policy let techno and dance culture become visible, if contested, parts of civic life. Germany and the Netherlands often pursued a different mix of policing and public health than Britain's more aggressively punitive measures. And that divergence shaped how raves evolved and how integrated they became. It would be dishonest to portray the dance floor as always safe. The same properties that made MDMA socially smoothing could become physically dangerous in hot, crowded venues with poor information. Dehydration, hypothermia, and a couple of unlucky pills containing the wrong chemical could hit emergency rooms, hard terrifying officials, and grabbing headlines. In the early 90s, a handful of highly publicized incidents produced an escalation in media rhetoric. Moral panic hardened into policy. Britain's enormous, unauthorized Castle Morton Common Festival in May 1992, an outdoor gathering that attracted tens of thousands over several days, became a symbol for those wanting stricter control of unlicensed mass events. The subsequent Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994 contained an oddly musical legal phrase. It targeted gatherings where music was characterized by the emission of a succession of repetitive beats. That strangely specific wording made the legislation a blunt instrument aimed squarely at raves. It criminalized particular forms of communal listening and pushed many events further out of sight. In the United States, the path was different, but rhymed with the British story. Warehouse parties in cities like New York, Detroit, and Chicago already housed techno and house. MDMA slotted naturally into those nights. The US never passed a single music-targeting law like Britain's repetitive beats clause, but a mesh of local ordinances, policing tactics, and sensational media coverage had similar chilling effects, driving gatherings away from mainstream spaces and deeper underground. American rave culture developed its own codes and slogans, most notably PLUR, peace, love, unity, respect. That ethos of mutual care doubled as an informal harm reduction program in the face of hostile laws and real health risks. The idea that ravers should watch over one another, share water, seek help when needed, check on a stranger slumped against the wall was partly an organic cultural ethic, partly a practical response to the dangers of chemically intensified nights. That phrase harm reduction is worth dwelling on because it shows how subcultures adapt when zero-tolerance policies collide with ordinary human behavior. Through the 90s and beyond, volunteer groups formed to cover gaps in official responses. Teams handed out water, staffed chill-out areas, or used reagent testing kits so people could get at least a basic chemical check on their pills. Authorities did not always welcome them, but they clearly met an urgent need. The paradox was plain. Prohibition generates unregulated markets. Unregulated markets generate hazards. And then informal, often unsanctioned, systems arise to reduce those hazards. The global dance explosion rewired youth calendars. Festivals became international hubs where styles, drugs, and customs mixed and recombined. The Love Parade in Berlin, nights at the Hacienda, Ibiza's boat parties, Castle Morton's chaos. These were cultural flashpoints where the scene crystallized. They also became epidemiological nodes, places where new patterns of use, new pill designs, and new norms could rip across networks of travelers. In Istanbul, Sao Paulo, Sydney, and Taipei, distinctive local club cultures emerged. In some cities, ecstasy became a useful tool for venue owners, keeping crowds engaged and on the floor until dawn. In others, it wove into youth oppositional cultures, symbolizing defiance of conservative norms. The same molecule absorbed different meanings and values as it traveled through different moral economies. Meanwhile, production evolved. As demand swelled, underground manufacturers refined their processes. Pills diversified, both in their active ingredients and their visual appearance. Adulteration became a chronic danger. Reports in later years described tablets containing speed, synthetic cathinones, PMA, PMMA, or cheap inert fillers sold as MDMA. The 1990s and 2000s were an era of constant chemical improvisation. For many users, the main safety filter was simply social reputation. If someone they trusted had tried a given batch and seemed fine, that passed as quality control. For others, harm reduction groups and community testing labs offered ways to cut risk. Policymakers, however, mostly leaned on punishment, and that choice shaped the market more than it constrained it. The cultural irony is hard to miss. A molecule first embraced as a tool for intimacy and therapy helped nurture scenes that publicly celebrated connection and collective transcendence. But as MDMA scaled into mass culture, it invited criminalization, commodification, and the inevitable coarsening that comes with mass production. The therapeutic atom became nightlife ecstasy, and ecstasy then acquired every trait of a successful underground commodity: branding, supply chains, counterfeits, and a parallel economy of health warnings and safety advice. Music and MDMA adapted to each other. DJs learned to shape their sets in relation to the drug's time course, when to lift the tempo, when to bring in something gentler. Dancers learned, consciously or not, to modulate their bodies across a long night. By the end of the 20th century, MDMA had traveled a long way from those first modest clinical circles. It had become a global cultural vector, affecting how young people planned weekends, how cities budgeted for police coverage, and how public health agencies talked about risk. It helped shape rituals, the pre-party conversations, the quiet exchanges of pills, the dreamy debriefs in the early morning. In their kindness and sometimes in their recklessness, these rituals rearranged communal life in ways both subtle and enduring. Look back with a historian's patience and a storyteller's softness, and MDMA's path from therapy couch to warehouse rave seems almost unavoidable. Humans find tools that help them heal and then try them out socially. Then they legislate what frightens them. Then they adapt again, building clandestine markets, grassroots support systems, and new meanings on top of it all. This is not a tale of simple corruption or simple redemption. It is a wandering story about needs, economies, laws, music, and the improvised social ceremonies we call rituals. In that sense, Adam's journey from couch to club doubles as a parable of late modern life, an experiment in how we try to soften the difficulty of being together, how we push back against isolation, and how the very tools we discover for healing are quickly folded into other economies of pleasure and risk. The music kept going. People kept dancing. The molecule kept teaching. And in a deeply human way, the world kept trying to find itself in one another. The late 80s closed around MDMA like a long, slow camera shutter. Media outlets looking for sharp images and simple villains found a perfect symbol, a cute, smiling pill juxtaposed against either neon dance floors or stark hospital corridors. Television cut from sweating bodies in warehouses to gurneys and fluorescent-lit emergency rooms. Newspapers printed pictures of young people collapsed on lawns, paramedics bent over them, parents in pieces. Somewhere between these images, a new vocabulary took hold. Rave plague, brain burner, zombie drug. Language crafted to grab the eye and spike adrenaline. It provided clean, dramatic narratives for a nervous era. With the Cold War ebbing, states still needed threats, and the bright communal spaces of youth nightlife made for an easy target. The panic did not appear overnight. It was assembled piece by piece in newsrooms, political offices, advocacy meetings, and overburdened ERs, where a few real tragedies were elevated into the shape of a looming epidemic, then retold so many times that the story began substituting for the reality. A consistent pattern emerged. A death at a party would be chalked up to ecstasy before toxicology reports were complete. Correlation was presented as straightforward causation. Animal findings were presented as mirrors of human fate. This wasn't mere sloppiness, it was a familiar social mechanism. As sociologist Stanley Cohen showed in his work on moral panics, societies under stress look for folk devils, figures that embody threat, like the reckless youth or the intoxicated outsider. The press obliges. In the MDMA episode, the folk devil was both tiny and monstrous. A small, chalky pill that, according to headlines, could dissolve brain tissue and send death pulsing invisibly through dance floors. Politicians quickly mastered the script. Photographs of grieving parents and crowded raves offered dramatic backdrops for shows of urgency. A worried public asked for action. Officials eager to expand policing budgets or demonstrate toughness in the war on drugs embraced MDMA as a convenient justification. Fear-driven coverage fed political ambition. Political action fed further fear. Beneath the soundbites and large font headlines, scientific discussion was far more cautious and conflicted than the media allowed. Starting in the mid to late 1980s, neuroscientists reported that certain MDMA dosing regimens produced long-lasting changes in serotonin systems in lab animals. In rodents and non-human primates exposed to heavy or repeated dosing schedules, measures associated with serotonin neurons declined. Thomas E. Ricaurte's name, among others, became linked with these findings, partly because the early results were striking and easily turned into dramatic graphics. Photos of stained brain slices ran next to dire warnings about neurotoxicity. Yet the bridge from laboratory bench to nightly news ignored key details. The doses required to produce detectable changes in animals were frequently high relative to what typical human users took. Environmental factors like forced hypothermia or prolonged stress during experiments affected outcomes. The routes and frequencies of administration often did not match real-world human patterns. And the simple fact that animal brains differ from human brains in structure, complexity, and context was frequently flattened out in popular retellings. Two major errors carried much of the load in the panic. The first was over-extrapolation, drawing a straight, unbroken line from a rodent's neurochemical changes at high doses to irreversible brain damage in casual clubgoers. The second was omission, failing to account for other drugs, pre-existing health issues, and situational stressors, overcrowding, overheating, dehydration, that frequently shaped outcomes. Coupled with our basic preference for clear enemies and clean causal stories, these errors generated a narrative that stuck. Even within science, there was no consensus. Some groups reported more modest or reversible changes. Others warned that the public conversation was crushing nuance into fear. But nuance did not sell advertising. Alarm did. Advocacy organizations and political actors amplified the scariest interpretations. Parent coalitions, conservative think tanks, and law and order campaigns converged on a shared image. Youth culture spiraling out of control, egged on by a friendly-looking pill with a deceptively light-hearted name. The rhetoric charged quickly from danger to plague. Interior ministers, congressional panels, parliamentary committees took up a moralizing tone. Cameras gravitated to outrage rather than measured analysis. In the UK, highly visible free parties and warehouse raves collided with a conservative government keenly attuned to questions of order. Local magistrates and police leaders in the Midlands and elsewhere began pressing for expanded powers. In the US, crisis language fit easily inside an already expanding drug war, giving policymakers fresh grounds to push emergency measures and punitive solutions over public health-oriented ones. Panic is convenient for policymaking. Convenience does not equal wisdom. In an atmosphere of fear, uncertainty itself was treated as an argument for rapid crackdowns rather than for deeper study. Emergency scheduling, fast-track criminalization, and high-profile enforcement wins were easier to package than slow-funded research or on-site harm reduction. The results were long-lasting. Funding streams, ethics approvals, and the bureaucratic patience necessary to study a tightly controlled substance shrank. Therapists who had been using MDMA in careful, structured contexts with trauma survivors faced a hard choice: stop entirely or continue in the shadows. For veterans with entrenched PTSD, for people wrestling with long-standing relational wounds, the early promise visible in pre-1985 case studies was abruptly postponed. Criminalization did not arrive as one clean edict. It took shape through a stack of administrative actions, scheduling hearings, and international agreements that together closed down legal and clinical options. In the US, the Drug Enforcement Administration moved in the mid-80s to classify MDMA in the strictest category. Emergency scheduling placed it alongside drugs officially deemed to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. That choice echoed internationally. The administrative process that followed, petitions, hearings, courtroom challenges, did include voices from within the establishment. An administrative law judge, reviewing evidence of therapeutic use and the limited indications of dependence, suggested a more moderate scheduling strategy that would permit some controlled medical use. The recommendation was overruled by agency leadership under intense public and political pressure. The result was a decade-spanning legal lockdown. Researchers now faced grueling licensing protocols. Many clinicians who had used MDMA as a carefully controlled adjunct in therapy concluded the legal risks were too high. That lockdown had more than symbolic weight. In effect, the burden of proof shifted decisively onto anyone wanting to study therapeutic applications. Schedule I-style controls meant stricter security, costly permits, and an awkward supply chain. Only a few authorized labs could produce MDMA for research, and obtaining it involved layers of bureaucracy. Many potential investigators steered clear, unwilling to navigate the administrative and political minefield. Grant review panels, wary of controversy or feasibility problems, often refused to fund MDMA work. The net effect was a deep lull in legitimate clinical study. At the same time, MDMA's social life outside the clinic changed shape dramatically. Before severe criminal penalties, MDMA had inhabited a scene between therapy circles and nightlife. It was used in some contexts as a therapeutic catalyst, in others as a facilitator of shared joy. Once criminalized, it was pushed further into less supervised, more anonymous environments. Older, more cautious users withdrew. Younger, more risk-tolerant users gravitated to clubs and raves, spaces where anonymity and uneven enforcement made distribution more feasible. Supply chains adapted to this new demand. A practice that had sometimes looked like small, friendship-based sharing, usually unbranded and low-volume, evolved into a more recognizable market. Production ramped up, pills were pressed in large batches. Dealers began to differentiate products with stamps and names. Reputation now had both economic value and a limited protective function. Under prohibition, consistent dosage and recognizable branding become partial substitutes for regulation. A batch known to be strong but clean could move quickly, and the name attached to it took on meaning. Prohibition altered risk profiles. In clinical settings, doses were weighed, people were screened, the surroundings were controlled. In festival fields or side streets, doses became guesses, pills turned into semi-random combinations, and environmental stressors exploded. Criminalization did not turn off demand. It changed who supplied and how. Economics pushed towards scale and secrecy. Larger operations and organized networks filled the gaps. As production expanded, MDMA shifted from something that might be mixed by a specialized chemist with personal stakes in quality toward a commodity made in high volume. That shift would drive new rounds of adulteration, corporatized underground branding, and a steadily more technical cat-and-mouse game between manufacturers and law enforcement. As clandestine production grew, the technical and economic logic of the underground market became clearer. Small-batch kitchen syntheses, once possible in hobbyist setups, were gradually overshadowed in some regions by industrial-scale labs. The change was uneven and opportunistic, shaped by geography, chemical access, and enforcement pressure. From the late 1980s through the 1990s, Western Europe, especially the Netherlands and Belgium, emerged as major hubs. It wasn't just geography. These countries had dense chemical industries, pockets of relatively lax oversight, access to skilled workers, and ports that made shipping easy. For criminal entrepreneurs, the math was simple. Pills produced cheaply in Europe could fetch high prices in the UK, Germany, Scandinavia, and beyond. Producers clustered where precursor chemicals were accessible and where the risk of rapid detection felt lowest. Precursors became the choke points of this system, and so they became the focus of policy. Initially, many clandestine syntheses relied on oils and extracts from trees like sassafras botanical starting points for key aromatic intermediates used to make MDMA. When national and international bodies began tracking and controlling those raw materials, producers adapted. They sought alternative synthetic routes, shifted purchases to countries with weaker oversight, or moved precursors through front companies and convoluted import chains. A familiar chase dynamic took hold. Each time one molecule on the supply side was tightly regulated, labs pivoted to a new pathway or a different supplier country. Enforcement moved more slowly than commerce. For a time, the Netherlands retained a central role because its logistical advantages outweighed enforcement risks. Massive underground labs were periodically dismantled, but others appeared elsewhere, more remote, more cleverly concealed. With scale came professionalization. Pill presses replaced hand-formed tablets. Branding turned into a core business strategy. Logos, 3 diamonds, cartoon figures, car badges, stylized initials functioned as crude seals of identity and implied potency. Dealers promoted specific stamps. Consumers, in the absence of formal oversight, started to treat those images as stand-ins for quality. A trusted brand could demand a higher price and minimize the fallout from disappointed or harmed buyers. Paradoxically, this criminal marketplace was pulled between secrecy and the need for reliability. Illegality demanded concealment. Profit demanded predictability. Some networks evolved internal quality standards in order to maintain reputation. At the same time, the temptation to cut costs or stretch supply with cheaper materials never vanished. Adulteration became a constant. Sometimes it was simple. A bit of caffeine or amphetamine added to increase stimulation and reduce the amount of MDMA needed per pill. Sometimes it was more dangerous. Partial or total substitution with PMA or PMMA compounds that can be far more toxic at recreational doses. These swaps weren't always deliberate acts of malice. A mislabeled precursor, an inexperienced chemist, or a faulty process could yield related compounds with significantly different pharmacology. The public consequences, however, were stark. Clusters of serious illnesses and deaths, often young people collapsing at parties, created sudden bursts of media coverage and political outrage. High-profile tragedies drove urgent policy responses, cross-border raids, large seizures, new controls on precursor chemicals, extraditions. Yet because the market was distributed and adaptive, many of these victories were temporary. Supply routes shifted, production rebounded elsewhere, and the basic economics remained. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, technology began reshaping distribution. The internet and later encrypted messaging apps and cryptocurrencies created new channels that didn't fit the old enforcement paradigms. Darknet marketplaces, Silk Road and its descendants offered buyers and sellers relative anonymity, a rating system, and a way to build reputations independent of pill stamps. The risk profile changed. Packaging became more discreet, shipments smaller but more frequent, payments harder to trace. Law enforcement had to add cyber capabilities to the usual customs and street-level work. Public health responses evolved unevenly. In some countries, famously, the Netherlands, harm reduction became a formal pragmatic component of policy. On-site medical tents at events, free water, accessible information, and, crucially, drug-checking services. In other places, zero tolerance remained the loudest political message, and harm reduction programs were allowed to operate only precariously, if at all. Grassroots organizations stepped into this vacuum, using reagent kits and later more advanced analytic tools to test pills at parties, run drop-in testing services, and distribute non-judgmental advice about dosage, hydration, and what to do in an emergency. These volunteer programs often clashed with authorities. Police feared that testing looked like approval. Harm reduction workers argued that testing simply acknowledged reality and saved lives. That argument rarely fit into a soundbite, but accumulating evidence, notably from European pilot projects, showed that drug checking could reduce harms, warning users away from particularly dangerous batches, alerting communities to novel substances, and encouraging more cautious behavior. The technical and economic evolution of the illicit market had predictable health consequences. In periods when purity and dosage consistency improved, certain risks decreased. Fewer overdoses arising from wildly inconsistent tablets, more stable expectations about effects. When new synthetic drugs or dangerous substitutes entered the stream, harm spiked. Media, politicians, and the public often experienced these spikes as proof that ecstasy itself had suddenly become deadlier, when in reality the label was now covering an unstable assortment of different chemicals. Underneath it all sat a stubborn policy paradox. Leaders who promised to eradicate use found themselves trapped in a perpetual pursuit. Those who advocated more nuanced strategies, decriminalization, supervised quality control, broad harm reduction, often struggled against the emotional power of the Rave plague story. That phrase did its work. It collapsed a complex social, chemical, and economic process into a horror image that was easy to legislate against. The story of MDMA's black market is therefore not just about drug chemistry. It is also about institutional behavior, how regulators and police adapt to constraint, how underground entrepreneurs follow opportunity, how scientists chase patterns within messy partial data, how clinicians try to help, how partygoers and patients search for relief or joy in the only contexts available to them. It winds through port cities and quiet labs, through clandestine warehouses and university ethics boards, through community centers and courtrooms. And when, in time, the initial panic softened and some space reopened for science, researchers were finally able to return to the fundamentals: what MDMA does, what it damages or heals, and how to distinguish between justified concern and exaggerated fear. By then, though, markets had mutated, criminal networks had solidified, and an entire cohort of people who might have benefited from carefully controlled MDMA-assisted treatment had lived and often suffered without access. The panic, the criminalization, and the evolution of the underground market had braided together. Alarm made it easy to impose harsh law, Harsh law drove commerce into secrecy. Secrecy multiplied danger and produced new tragedies, which in turn fed more alarm. Policy, business, and culture became knotted into a single rope. That rope is instructive. When fear pushes societies into sweeping bans and punishments, the resulting landscape can actually magnify the very harms those measures were supposed to prevent, making problems harder to monitor, harder to treat, and harder to discuss honestly. The irony is sharp. A drug once discussed quietly among therapists as a potential instrument of healing became, in the language of the era, an emergency to be governed with maximum force. That emergency framing slowed the scientific work that might have clarified MDMA's real boundaries, its dangers, its potential benefits much earlier. Through the 1990s and into the new century, MDMA's human story split into two interlaced paths. One path carried the heavy boots of raids, seizures, sentencing hearings, and big political speeches about cracking down. The other path wound through less visible terrain. Small research teams filing complex applications, trauma survivors enrolling in early pilot studies, volunteers running harm reduction tables at festivals, quietly testing pills and handing out earplugs, water, and advice. Markets continued innovating around enforcement. The policy world, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes creatively, began to realize that proclamations alone would not produce safety or insight. If there is a consolation in this history, it is that headlines did not entirely define the outcome. Scientists and clinicians, though delayed and constrained, kept designing better studies. Activists who had once been dismissed as naive or irresponsible built organizations with enough rigor to satisfy regulators and funders. Groups like MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, kept at it, litigating scheduling decisions, raising donations, publishing data, and eventually sponsoring large-scale clinical trials. Slowly, after decades of chill, MDMA research began to reclaim a place in mainstream medicine. That return came with its own tensions and contradictions. It also underscored a simple lesson. Policies forged in fear tend to be brittle. Policies built on open curiosity, evidence, and care are slower to create but more resilient over time. The clubs, the labs, the courts, and the emergency rooms all carry that lesson in their histories. The old rave plague rhetoric still buzzes faintly in public memory, but beneath it different voices now speak. People who have been helped in therapy, people who survived adulterated pills because a tester caught the danger, and researchers who learned how to work carefully with a drug once written off as a menace. When Molly arrived as a branded promise crystalline, modern, supposedly pure, it slipped into the culture with the relaxed confidence of a new lifestyle product. The name sounded intimate and domesticated, folding a complex molecule into a friendly nickname. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, as EDM festivals grew from niche gatherings into massive spectacles from Miami to Manchester, sellers learned a straightforward marketing truth. People will pay extra for what they believe is cleaner and safer. Molly was packaged in little plastic bags and foil packets, sometimes with logos, sometimes showcased in photos lined up like candy under fluorescent lights. The visuals were deliberate. Bright crystals, clean typefaces, slick social media posts. Pills felt old world, associated with unknown presses and uneven contents. Powder or crystal, in contrast, was branded as direct from the lab molecular MDMA. The myth of purity found fertile ground. At first, there was sometimes a grain of reality. Certain supply chains did deliver high-quality crystalline MDMA, and experienced users noticed the difference. But very quickly, imagery and naming did more work than chemistry. As the market shifted from pressed tablets to crystalline forms, distribution lines changed. Clandestine chemists with access to relatively pure MDMA freebase learned to recrystallize and market the result as a premium product. In the same way that craft breweries rebranded beer as artisanal, Molly rebranded MDMA as a boutique substance, something you could pay more for and feel smarter about. Yet behind the marketing, old dynamics persisted. When real MDMA was plentiful, much of what was sold as Molly actually was MDMA. When supplies tightened due to precursor controls, police operations, or disrupted production vendors did what illegal markets almost always do. They substituted. PMA and PMMA, paramethoxyamphetamine and paramethoxymethamphetamine, became some of the most notorious substitutes. Related to MDMA on paper, they behave quite differently in bodies. They act more slowly, hit thermoregulation harder, and carry a narrower safety margin. Someone expecting the relatively quick onset of MDMA who takes a dose of PMA may feel little at first. Assume the batch is weak and take more. By the time the drug takes hold, total levels can be dangerously high. For decades now, PMA and PMMA have been implicated in festival deaths across Europe and Australia. The rise of synthetic cathinones, the bath salts class, added another layer. Compounds like mephedrone, methylone, MDPV, and later N-ethylpentalone were cooked up and marketed to exploit legal loopholes. Some, such as methylone, mimic parts of MDMA's profile, but with shorter duration and a more jittery stimulant edge. To many customers, they were sold simply as Molly, indistinguishable in name from MDMA despite being pharmacologically distinct. In North America and parts of Europe during the mid-2010s, systematic testing showed a sobering pattern. A notable share of samples sold as Molly contained little or no MDMA. Instead, they held methylone, mephedrone, various stimulant cocktails, or complex mixes of multiple new psychoactive substances. Vendors used brand recognition, Molly, to move whatever stock they could acquire cheaply. Other, subtler adulterants crept in. Small amounts of methamphetamine or caffeine padded out products. Benzodiazepines sometimes appeared, either as contaminants or as deliberate additions meant to blunt edginess and encourage repeat use. In recent years, the spread of fentanyl through illegal supply chains in North America has raised a new concern: trace opioid contamination, even in drugs never intended to act on opioid receptors. While still relatively rare in MDMA samples compared to other street drugs, any such contamination multiplies the risk of an already unpredictable experience. All of this turned the promise of Molly as a pure alternative into a kind of dangerous illusion. Risk perception followed the marketing, not the chemistry. Believing Molly was safer, some users increased their doses, redosed more often, or mixed more casually with other substances. They traveled long distances to festivals with a false sense of control, thinking that crystal form guaranteed contents. The reality was far messier. Adulteration patterns varied by region and over time, responding to supply constraints, enforcement actions, and precursor availability. A bag of white crystals in one city might be mostly MDMA. In another, a cathinone blend. In a third, a scattershot mix of several drugs. Policy reactions to Molly-related scares combined suppression and messaging. US agencies issued warnings. British tabloids ran lurid spreads on the Molly menace. Officials in Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere launched campaigns urging caution or abstinence at festivals, while police intensified searches and raids. But the more interesting movement came from below, from communities that doubted the state's ability or willingness to keep them safe. Harm reduction organizations, some with roots going back to the 1990s, others born in the social media era, began offering what both the illegal market and the formal policy world failed to deliver: timely, specific information about what people were actually taking. Drug-checking services multiplied and diversified. Under tents behind festival stages, in small offices in city centers, volunteers and technicians set up makeshift labs. The simplest tests used liquid reagents that changed color in the presence of certain chemical groups. These could quickly flag suspicious samples pills that turned the wrong color, indicating they were unlikely to be MDMA. When funding and logistics allowed, more advanced tools came in: portable Fourier transform infrared spectrometers and occasionally gas chromatography mass spectrometry rigs. The earliest low-tech kits were crude, but effective enough to make a difference in real time. They couldn't quantify purity, but they could often distinguish MDMA-like substances from obviously different stimulants or PMA-type compounds. FTIR, coupled with expansive spectral libraries, greatly improved identification. Technicians could compare a sample spectrum against known signatures and spot more nuanced adulteration. Organizations such as Energy Control in Spain, the Drugs Information and Monitoring System, DIMNs in the Netherlands, and later services in the UK and elsewhere, built relationships with event organizers and local authorities. In some places, they operated openly with official support. In others, testers worked in a grey zone, tolerated quietly so long as they did not attract too much attention. A typical testing booth at a festival might not look dramatic. A pop-up tent, plastic tables, a couple of people in gloves and lanyards, a small queue of attendees stepping forward to surrender part of a pill or pinch of powder. Anonymity stressed, results delivered discreetly. Along with the findings came conversation: what the compound was, what to expect, how to dose more conservatively, when to seek help. Studies of these services showed a range of reactions. Some people, when told their sample contained something unexpected, PMA instead of MDMA, or a cathinone blend, chose to discard it. Others still used it, deciding to reduce their dose or simply gambling that they could handle it. The best programs treated the test result as a starting point for dialogue, not an end point. Here's what we found. Here's what that means for your risk. Here's what you can do to lower it. In jurisdictions where police and public health shared a pragmatic understanding, such programs significantly improved responses to emerging dangers. If a batch of particularly strong or adulterated pills was identified early at a festival, warnings could go out quickly through on-site announcements, social media, or temporary alerts. In other places, where possession itself meant testers could be arrested, these services remained rare or underground, limiting their impact. Concrete case series highlight what was at stake. One European summer saw 11 festival-goers admitted with severe hypothermia and agitation. Lab results later revealed PMMA in their systems, a slow-onset drug taken in a context of high expectations and redosing, had led several people to inadvertently overdose. In a different US city, an ER recorded a cluster of young adults in extreme distress, racing hearts, seizures, paranoia. Analysis showed methadone plus amphetamine, sold as Molly. These were not stories of MDMA suddenly turning malevolent. They were stories of misbranding, substitution, and information gaps between seller and buyer. Where testing and surveillance existed, clinicians and public health experts could respond faster and more precisely. Where they did not, rumors and generalized fear filled the vacuum. If adulteration and harm reduction describe the supply and community responses, then the next part of the story, MDMA's risks, is where pharmacology meets the body directly. MDMA's acute effects follow from its action on serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine systems. It triggers release, blocks reuptake, and pushes these signaling systems into temporarily altered states. The same cascade that produces euphoria and openness also stresses cardiovascular and thermoregulatory systems. Hypothermia, dangerously elevated body temperature, is the most dramatic immediate threat. At a crowded, poorly ventilated show with high ambient heat, intense dancing, and no easy access to cooling or rest, MDMA's interference with normal heat dissipation can tip someone into heat stroke and multi-organ failure. It is not the drug alone, nor the environment alone, but their interaction that is lethal. Hydration advice, while essential, comes with its own trap. MDMA increases secretion of vasopressin, antidiuretic hormone, in many users. As a result, the kidneys retain water. If someone hears only "drink lots of water" and responds by compulsively chugging large amounts, their blood sodium can drop to dangerously low levels. This hyponatremia causes brain swelling, seizures, and, in some cases, death. Case reports over the 2000s and 2010s repeatedly highlighted this risk, especially among young women who appeared overrepresented in fatalities, possibly due to sex differences in vasopressin response and body water composition. Serotonin syndrome is another acute concern. It arises when serotonergic activity becomes excessive, most commonly when MDMA is combined with other serotonin-boosting drugs such as MAO inhibitors, certain antidepressants, or other recreational substances. Symptoms can include agitation, tremor, clonus, high fever, and unstable blood pressure. The syndrome overlaps clinically with malignant hypothermia, making rapid, skilled medical assessment critical. Cardiac complications, arrhythmias, infarctions are less common, but do occur particularly in users with unknown heart disease or in older individuals. And in real-world settings, MDMA rarely appears alone. Alcohol, cocaine, benzodiazepines, opioids, and other stimulants are frequently in the mix. Emergency doctors evaluating a collapsed partygoer are usually dealing with an unknown, multi-drug tapestry rather than a single substance. Emergency department statistics paint a complex but not apocalyptic picture. MDMA-related visits represent a modest fraction of all drug-related emergencies in many countries, yet they draw disproportionate attention, partly because victims are often young and previously healthy. Fatalities remain rare relative to total use, but when they occur, circumstances are often complicated. High doses, harsh environments, adulterants, and polydrug use colliding. Which is to say, MDMA is neither harmless nor uniformly catastrophic. Risk rises with dose and frequency, with hot and crowded settings, with combinations, and with individual vulnerabilities. Harm tends to cluster around particular contexts and patterns of use. Long-term effects are more uncertain and have fueled decades of argument. Animal work from the late 1980s and 1990s clearly demonstrated that under certain conditions, repeated high doses, often combined with elevated temperature MDMA, can damage serotonergic axons. Markers of serotonin transmission fell. Histological studies showed reduced fiber density. This established that the molecule could be neurotoxic in non-human species under specific regimens. Translating that to humans is difficult. Species metabolize drugs differently. Lab animals are often subjected to non-physiological dosing, multiple injections in a short window, environmental stresses, immobilization. Human use patterns are more varied and usually lower in cumulative load, though heavy users can approach experimental ranges. Human research has produced mixed, often contradictory findings. Cross-sectional cognitive studies have sometimes found that heavy or long-term MDMA users perform worse on tasks involving verbal memory and certain executive functions than non-users. PET imaging has shown reduced serotonin transporter binding in some user groups. Yet these studies are riddled with confounds. Polydrug use, pre-existing differences in personality or mental health, socioeconomic factors, and the basic unreliability of self-reporting drug histories. A handful of prospective longitudinal studies where participants are tested before any MDMA exposure and followed over time offer stronger causal insight. Even so, sample sizes are small, follow-up times limited, and generalizability uncertain. Emerging evidence suggests that chronic heavy use can be associated with mild but persistent deficits in certain cognitive domains, and that some of these may improve with prolonged abstinence. But the patterns are not simple, and individual responses vary. Genetic and metabolic differences add another layer. Variants in liver enzymes like CYP2D6 can change how quickly or slowly individuals clear MDMA and its metabolites. Slow metabolizers may experience higher and longer-lasting exposures at standard doses, increasing their risk of both acute and possibly long-term adverse effects. These scientific disagreements are not merely academic. They shape policy. If regulators assume MDMA is uniformly and dramatically neurotoxic, even at moderate doses, they are likely to sustain strict prohibitions and starve research. If advocates minimize risk entirely, they risk downplaying real harms for vulnerable subgroups and undermining trust when problems do arise. An honest stance acknowledges both sides. MDMA carries real acute risks and plausible long-term risks, especially with heavy, frequent use. But those risks are graded, not absolute. They can be reduced through education, environmental management, dose moderation, and avoidance of dangerous combinations, and they can be studied more effectively if research is not smothered by stigma and impossible red tape. Here, legal classification has mattered tremendously. Schedule I status in the US and equivalents elsewhere codified the view that MDMA had no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. For researchers, that meant lengthy approvals, strict storage rules, special licenses, and often institutional reluctance to host such work. Funding agencies shied away from controversial projects. Those who persisted often did so with private donations, at great personal and professional cost. There were also embarrassing episodes that set the field back. One high-profile primate study in the early 2000s reported severe neurotoxic effects after MDMA exposure only, for it to be retracted when it was discovered that the animals had, in fact, been given methamphetamine due to a labeling error. The incident fueled deep skepticism on both sides. Prohibitionists seized it as evidence of sloppy science in a permissive field, while reformers used it to argue that MDMA's dangers were overstated. Science nonetheless adapted. Better imaging techniques made it possible to assess serotonin systems more precisely in humans. Wastewater analysis emerged as a way to estimate community-level use without relying solely on surveys. Hair and nail sampling provided more objective exposure histories. Portable instruments improved drug-checking accuracy on the ground. Most notably, a rigorous clinical pathway for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in PTSD took shape. Driven not by Big Pharma, but by MAPS and a coalition of researchers, this program painstakingly navigated the regulatory maze, securing an investigational new drug approval, arranging for pharmaceutical-grade MDMA production, and designing multi-session psychotherapeutic protocols with careful safety monitoring. In 2017, the FDA granted breakthrough therapy designation to MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, a strong signal that early evidence suggested substantial benefit over existing treatments. Phase 3 trials that followed in the early 2020s reported large effect sizes and durable improvements for many participants suffering from severe, treatment-resistant PTSD. Those results had far-reaching effects. They reframed MDMA in public discourse, at least partly, from club drug to potential medicine. They demonstrated that a tightly controlled, therapist-intensive model could yield substantial therapeutic benefit with acceptable safety. They also opened new questions about cost, access, equity, therapist training, and the ethical challenges of integrating a once stigmatized substance into mainstream care. As the therapeutic narrative solidified, it did not erase the recreational one. Nor did it solve the systemic harms caused by decades of punitive enforcement. Instead, it created a new landscape in which MDMA is simultaneously an investigational medicine, an illegal commodity, a cultural symbol, and a site of contested memory. Navigating that landscape clinically, legally, ethically, has become one of the defining challenges of the present phase of MDMA's story. The clinical renaissance that people in the field like to call careful, bureaucratic, and even devotional did not arrive with fanfare. It unfolded through meticulously worded consent forms, in rooms lit by fluorescent panels and softened with a diffuser of lavender oil, in playlists compiled with the same care you might bring to a funeral or a wedding, and in the slow choreography of two therapists sitting on either side of a floor lamp while a worn-out veteran finally spoke a memory without the tremor that had haunted it for years. That sort of scene, a quiet chorus of chart paper, beeping monitors, and human breathing, is where MDMA's 21st century story takes on a different tone. Not a street myth about bliss and collapse, not a crime brief, but a clinical narrative of hypotheses, protocols, regulatory filings, and a stubborn willingness to move slowly. Rick Doblin, who founded MAPS in 1986, became one of those persistent figures historians describe with a kind of dry amazement usually reserved for patient litigators or small-town clergy. He spent decades pressing for something that looks obvious in hindsight: the right to test, under careful and ethical conditions, whether a stigmatized drug could help people who had exhausted other options. That vision took concrete form in a bureaucratic architecture. MAPS raised money through individual donations and foundation grants. They built a training pipeline for therapists. They learned how to speak FDA language, negotiate with institutional review boards, and satisfy layers of regulatory oversight. Clinical investigators like Michael Mithofer shouldered the practical side, drafting treatment manuals, designing the psychotherapy model, managing patient screening and follow-up, and guiding participants through preparation, dosing, and integration. Bessel van der Kolk's work also began to intersect with this emerging field. The Boston trauma specialist, whose later book, The Body Keeps the Score, helped popularize the idea that trauma resides not just in thought, but in bodily memory, became one of the clinicians prepared to explore MDMA as a way to reach those somatic layers when conventional talk therapies stalled. By the 2000s and 2010s, what had once been improvisational underground practice was reshaped into a formal, repeatable model. Not ad hoc sessions, but a manual, standardized across research sites. That standardization served two functions. It satisfied scientific demands for reproducibility, and it embodied an ethical promise that safety would not depend solely on individual therapist judgment or charisma. The treatment structure took on a recognizable rhythm. First came screening, both physical and psychiatric, to rule out cardiovascular vulnerabilities, psychotic disorders, or bipolar conditions that might be destabilized by a strong serotonergic agent. Then came two or more preparatory meetings, in which therapists and patient established rapport, explained what to expect, practiced grounding techniques, and clarified consent. These sessions also clarified something subtle but vital. MDMA was not being offered as a miracle pill. It was a facilitator inside a much larger psychotherapeutic container. The dosing sessions themselves lasted much of a day, usually around 8 hours. The patient lay on a couch or reclined on a futon. Two therapists, often one male, one female, remained present throughout. Music filled the room at a carefully calibrated volume. Eye shades were available for those who wanted to turn inward. The therapists did not direct in the usual sense. They followed, inviting and supporting rather than leading. Dose regimens in MAPS-sponsored protocols commonly involved an initial 125 milligrams of MDMA, with the option of an additional half dose about 90 minutes later. Most trial designs permitted 2 or 3 such MDMA sessions, each separated by several weeks. Between and after these dosing days came integration therapy, ordinary talk sessions in which the experiences and insights from the MDMA state were examined and linked to daily life. The overall approach was labor-intensive, and intentionally so. It treated pharmacology as one component in a longer therapeutic arc, not as a standalone cure. Early published results were small in scale, but compelling. Mithofer's 2011 randomized controlled Trial 1 of the first modern studies to pit MDMA-assisted psychotherapy against an inactive control showed substantial reductions in PTSD symptom scores among those receiving the active drug, with many participants crossing thresholds from severe to mild or from mild to remission. The study was cautious, its authors clear about limitations and the need for larger, more diverse samples. But it signaled that this was not just placebo or hype. Phase 2 studies over the following decade repeated and extended these findings across different groups: combat veterans, survivors of assault, first responders. While subject numbers remained modest compared to giant pharmaceutical trials, a pattern emerged. For a meaningful portion of people with long-standing treatment-resistant PTSD, MDMA-assisted therapy produced large and durable improvements. Not everyone improved, and not all improvements lasted indefinitely. But the average effect size was striking when compared to many existing treatments. Regulators noticed. In 2017, the FDA granted MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD a breakthrough therapy designation, a formal recognition that preliminary evidence suggested substantial benefit over standard care, and that faster, more collaborative development was warranted. In bureaucratic terms, this meant more frequent meetings with regulators, clearer guidance, and the possibility of expedited review. In symbolic terms, it was something else, an acknowledgement that a drug locked in Schedule I could also be a promising medicine. MAPS spun out MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, MAPS PBC, to handle the development and potential commercialization of pharmaceutical-grade MDMA under a public benefit model. Securing GMP, good manufacturing practice, production was itself a diplomatic feat. Manufacturers had to be persuaded to produce a stigmatized compound under strict standards. Regulators had to be satisfied about import, storage, and dosing controls. As trials moved into Phase 3, the scale expanded. Multiple sites across the US, and in some cases in Canada and other countries, followed unified protocols. 3 MDMA-assisted sessions interlaced with several non-drug therapy meetings, repeated for dozens of participants. Outcomes were tracked not only with PTSD symptom scales, but also with functional measures work status, relationships, comorbid substance use. Follow-up visits extended months and, in some studies, years beyond the final dose to gauge persistence of benefit. The published Phase 3 results in the early 2020s reported that a significant majority of participants receiving MDMA-assisted therapy experienced clinically meaningful improvement, and a substantial subset no longer met diagnostic criteria for PTSD at follow-up. These gains for many persisted at 12 or 18 months. Safety profiles within this highly controlled context were acceptable. Blood pressure and heart rate rose during sessions. Transient anxiety or low mood sometimes followed afterward, but serious adverse events were rare and carefully managed. Still, methodological challenges remained. Blinding was imperfect. MDMA's distinctive subjective effects made it hard to keep participants and therapists unaware of who had received what, even when active placebos were used. Expectancy, the belief that one is receiving a powerful treatment, could exaggerate reported benefits. Therapist allegiance to the method risked influencing outcomes. Samples, although more diverse than before, still skewed toward those with the ability and willingness to enter trials. Often white, often with some access to care, often veterans already embedded in health systems. Questions of equity and scalability rose quickly. The therapy model, involving many hours of clinician time and specialized training, is expensive by design. Estimates for a full course of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy can reach tens of thousands of dollars when therapist hours, facility use, and overhead are counted. That raises blunt questions. Who will be able to access this if it becomes an approved treatment? Will it be covered by insurance? Will it remain the province of well-resourced clinics serving insured or affluent patients, while marginalized communities who have often borne the brunt of PTSD and the war on drugs remain excluded? Therapist training itself became a choke point. The method called for a particular blend of skills: trauma-informed practice, comfort with non-ordinary states of consciousness, strong boundaries, cultural humility. Training programs developed by MAPS and others emphasized not only technical protocol, but ethics, handling increased suggestibility, maintaining physical and emotional boundaries in prolonged, emotionally intense sessions, and knowing how to respond if memories or feelings emerged that touched on abuse, self-harm, or deep shame. Because MDMA fosters trust and reduces fear, the risk of boundary crossings, subtle or overt, was obviously amplified. The field began to wrestle with building mechanisms for supervision, complaint, and discipline that went beyond the usual professional bodies. Proposals included independent certification boards, mandatory reporting and review of adverse events, and public registries of trained providers. Alongside these clinical and regulatory developments, culture and memory continued to shape how MDMA was understood. Narratives about the drug had accumulated. The early therapist stories of Adam as a tool for emotional openness. The rave-era tales of dance, connection, and sometimes disaster. The moral panics and scheduling battles. The police raids and prison sentences, and now the carefully framed stories of veterans and survivors experiencing relief in clinical contexts. Which stories got told and who told them mattered. Mainstream memoirs and documentaries often highlighted sympathetic figures: combat veterans burned out by war, middle-class assault survivors, clinicians with impeccable credentials. Far less frequently foregrounded were people from communities that had been over-policed for drug offenses. Black and brown youth arrested at parties, low-income users swept into carceral systems, families destabilized by criminal records and surveillance. The early rave culture that had fueled MDMA's public notoriety and many of its harms was often flattened into cautionary anecdotes or aesthetic backdrops, rather than treated as a community of people whose experiences, joys, and losses also deserved careful listening. Meanwhile, the emerging medical narrative sometimes framed MDMA as having been redeemed by science, quietly sidestepping the decades of criminalization and underground experimentation that had kept its flame alive. Music and art continued to serve as unofficial archives. Tracks, zines, oral histories, and internet forums preserved memories that formal policy reports ignored. The strange generosity of strangers on dance floors, the role of MDMA in queer and marginalized communities, building temporary safer spaces, the fear and stigma that followed highly publicized deaths. Academic studies on neurobiology and psychotherapy ran parallel to fan-made documentaries, long-form magazine pieces, and social media threads about bad batches, test kits, and the best ways to support someone on a difficult role. In public debates, these layers of memory collided. Advocates for medicalization emphasized controlled clinical contexts and the suffering of people with PTSD who lacked adequate treatments. Critics raised concerns about normalizing a drug they still associated with chaotic nightlife and lawlessness. Harm reductionists argued that these were not separate conversations, that any honest policy had to address both MDMA's therapeutic potential and the damage done by decades of punitive enforcement. That convergence of medicine, harm reduction, and history is where the current policy debate now sits. The questions are no longer only, does MDMA work for PTSD, or is MDMA dangerous at raves? But how should a society with this particular history of panic, punishment, and underground use now integrate a once criminalized drug into its healthcare system without repeating past injustices? And how do we protect people who will continue to use MDMA outside of clinics, even as it becomes a prescription treatment for others? Different futures are imaginable. One is narrowly medical. MDMA becomes available only in licensed facilities, under standardized protocols, to patients with carefully defined diagnoses. Another adds decriminalization for personal possession, redirecting resources from punishment to health and allowing harm reduction to operate openly. A third, more ambitious, includes restorative justice, expunging past possession convictions, investing in communities disproportionately harmed by drug laws, and ensuring representation for those communities in setting clinical and regulatory priorities. Whatever path is chosen, the practical tasks are concrete. Regulators must decide on scheduling changes, distribution controls, and monitoring systems. Health systems must figure out how to pay for long, therapist-heavy courses of treatment and how to train enough practitioners. Public health agencies need to scale up drug checking and festival medicine in places where MDMA will continue to be used informally. Researchers must keep following trial participants for years, not months, to track both safety and the durability of benefit. And culture must keep its memory broad enough to include more than one version of the story. Veterans in clinics and kids at raves, therapists and DJs, prosecutors and harm reduction volunteers, chemists in backyard labs and pharmacologists in university hospitals, all have played roles in MDMA's history, for better and worse. If there is one through line amid this complexity, it is that both uncritical enthusiasm and reflexive fear have caused harm. The underground therapist who believed too strongly and ignored boundaries, the legislator who feared too strongly and slammed doors on research, the dealer who believed their own marketing about purity, the journalist who believed the most lurid possible narrative. The work now is more modest and more demanding, to keep measuring, listening, and adjusting, to build systems that allow MDMA to be used wisely in clinics while minimizing the harms that still accompany its use in the wild, to recognize that the molecule itself is neither savior nor scourge, but a powerful tool that amplifies whatever human structures, clinical, social, legal, we place around it. In that sense, the end of this chapter is not an ending at all. It is a handoff from the era of panic and underground improvisation to an era where MDMA is increasingly governed by protocols, guidelines, and policies, but still haunted and enriched by its earlier lives. The challenge is to make those new structures as evidence-based, equitable, and humane as possible, while remembering the people and lessons that earlier eras ignored or deliberately forgot. The question that looms, once MDMA edges closer to formal medical approval, is no longer just pharmacological. It is moral, political, and historical. We are not writing rules for a brand new compound. We are revisiting a molecule that has already lived several different lives. Lab curiosity, underground clinical tool, rave catalyst, moral panic emblem, black market commodity, and now investigational medicine. One proposed future is strict medicalization. In this model, MDMA is legalized only within tightly regulated clinical settings, approved for specific diagnoses like PTSD. Doses are manufactured under pharmaceutical standards, administered by certified therapists in licensed centers, and tracked in registries. This future emphasizes safety and control. It offers a pathway for insurers to reimburse care and for health systems to plan. It also risks creating a rarefied, high-cost treatment accessible mainly to those with good insurance or personal wealth, leaving behind many of the people most harmed by trauma and by the war on drugs. Another future is decriminalization without full legal sale. Personal possession of small amounts would not be a crime. People caught with MDMA would be referred, where appropriate, to health services rather than courts. This approach, similar in spirit to Portugal's decriminalization framework, can dramatically reduce the collateral harms of criminal records. Lost jobs, housing barriers, family separation. It can also normalize harm reduction, making on-site testing, festival medical services, and non-judgmental education easier to implement. But without some parallel system of regulated supply, it leaves quality control entirely in underground hands. People are less likely to be jailed for MDMA, but still at risk from PMA-laced pills and mislabeled molly bags. A third possibility is continued prohibition layered with limited tentative harm reduction. This is essentially the status quo in many places. MDMA remains illegal. Law enforcement occasionally stages big busts. Small-scale test services operate where they can. Public messages oscillate between abstinence slogans and vague warnings. This model preserves the symbolic toughness of a drug war while quietly recognizing that the war cannot be fully won. It recycles many of the past's mistakes, criminalization that falls heaviest on marginalized communities, unstable and adulterated supply chains, and thinly funded health responses. A more ambitious and arguably more honest path would mix these approaches deliberately. It would treat MDMA-assisted psychotherapy as a regulated medical practice with high standards and broad access, decriminalize personal possession to reduce needless punishment, and strengthen harm reduction infrastructures wherever recreational use persists. It would also include measures of restorative justice, clearing old possession records, redirecting some of the economic benefits of medicalization toward communities damaged by past enforcement, and ensuring those communities have seats at the regulatory table. From a research standpoint, that kind of synthesis demands several things: large, long-term safety and efficacy studies that follow people for years after MDMA-assisted treatment, not just months. Trials that actively recruit participants across race, income, geography, and comorbid conditions, so that results don't merely generalize to the narrow groups easiest to reach. Better biomarkers and clinical predictors to identify who is likely to benefit and who may be at higher risk. More fine-grained mechanistic work tying subjective experiences in therapy to measurable changes in brain networks, hormones, and behavior. On the clinical side, it demands robust ethical guardrails. Informed consent must go beyond a signature. It should situate MDMA in its full context, its history of criminalization, its known risks, and the uncertainties that remain. Therapist training programs need to emphasize boundary management, trauma-informed practice, cultural competence, and accountability structures. Oversight should include independent mechanisms for patients to report harm or misconduct, and for those concerns to be investigated and addressed transparently. On the public health side, it means normalizing evidence-based harm reduction. Drug checking, whether at festivals, in permanent clinics, or via mail-in services, should be legally supported rather than tolerated at the margins. Basic education about MDMA dosing ranges, onset times, interactions, signs of heat stroke or hyponatremia should be as routine as alcohol safety messaging. Emergency responders and ER teams should receive specific training on MDMA-related presentations and on how adulterants like PMA, cathinones, or fentanyl can change the clinical picture. On the justice side, it means acknowledging that MDMA policy has not operated in a vacuum. People have gone to prison, lost custody of children, and been barred from employment for the same behavior that, in a different context, might soon be part of a respected medical treatment. A fair settlement with that history would include mechanisms for expunging simple possession records, reviewing past sentences, and investing in services and opportunities in neighborhoods that absorb disproportionate enforcement. The cultural work is no less important. Policymakers and the public must resist the temptation to rewrite MDMA's story as a simple arc from bad street drug to good medicine. The early therapists working illegally or in gray zones, the ravers who built harm reduction practices out of necessity, the users who suffered from bad batches and punitive courts, all are part of the lineage that made today's clinical trials possible. So are the chemists, lab animals, and trial volunteers who clarified risks. Honest storytelling makes room for all of this. It keeps the neon-soaked nights in the narrative alongside the therapy couches. It includes not only triumphant trial outcomes, but also the marginal cases. Those who did not improve, those who worsened, those who dropped out or felt harmed. It pairs the excitement of a new treatment with a clear-eyed look at cost, labor, and who might still be excluded. In practical terms, a humane MDMA policy could look like this. Medical access approve MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for clearly defined indications where evidence is strongest, starting with treatment-resistant PTSD. Create public and non-profit clinic models alongside private practice, so that cost does not make treatment a luxury good. Subsidize therapist training programs, especially for practitioners from underrepresented communities. Decriminalization and harm reduction. Remove criminal penalties for possession of small amounts intended for personal use. Legally protect and fund drug-checking services and festival medical teams. Develop and distribute clear public education about MDMA effects, interactions, dosing, and emergency signs. Research and surveillance fund long-term follow-up studies on both clinical and recreational users. Support standardized data collection on adverse events and outcomes in clinical practice through national or international registries. Integrate tools like wastewater analysis and anonymous testing data to monitor trends in purity and adulteration. Restorative justice. Implement mass expungement programs for simple MDMA possession. Direct a portion of profits from any approved MDMA therapy into grants or services for communities historically over-targeted by drug enforcement. Establish community advisory boards, comprised of people with lived experience of trauma, drug use, and criminalization to influence policy and clinical practice. Such a framework will not remove all harm. No drug policy can. People will still misuse MDMA. Some will have bad reactions. Some therapists will fail their patients. Some clandestine labs will keep operating. But compared to the world we have known, a patchwork of panic, prohibition, underground manufacture, and improvised care, a system that combines regulated access, decriminalized possession, robust harm reduction, and historical accountability would be an improvement. Less cruel, more informed, and better aligned with both science and lived experience. MDMA's story, taken as a whole, underscores a few durable truths. Fear-driven bans can create more chaos than they resolve. Uncritical enthusiasm can blind people to subtle or long-term risks. Black markets are efficient at meeting demand, but indifferent to safety. Communities will invent care practices when formal systems fail them. And science, when finally allowed to proceed, is capable of both confirming some old intuitions and overturning others. We are now at a point where that science, those communities and those old policy mistakes are all visible at once. The question is less what MDMA is than what we decide to build around it. What laws, what clinics, what informal supports, what stories. The molecule will keep doing what it does, releasing serotonin, altering fear responses, making some people feel open and others overwhelmed. Our task is to make sure the contexts in which it appears are as thoughtful, fair, and well-informed as possible. If there is an ethical core to this entire history, it is this: hope without safeguards can be reckless, and control without compassion can be brutal. A better path holds both ambition and restraint, access and protection in the same frame. It listens not only to trial data and economic projections, but also to those who danced, those who healed, and those who were harmed along the way.